Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning. Story 1. Alexandria's Forgotten Alchemist. You sit quietly in the shadows of a long-vanished city, Alexandria. Once a beacon of learning, its libraries were said to hold half the knowledge of the ancient world. But tonight, in your mind's eye, you're not in the bustling streets or marble courts. You're inside a modest chamber, oil lamps flickering on papyrus, the air heavy with myrrh, ink, and quiet ambition. The man before you is Zosimos of Panopolis, writing slowly, methodically, on scrolls that few will ever read. He does not know it, but his words will linger through 1,000 years of time. Zosimos was a Greco-Egyptian alchemist, living sometime between the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE. Born in Panopolis, modern-day Akhmim in Upper Egypt, he was steeped in a world where Egyptian mysticism, Greek philosophy, and early Christian and Gnostic thought converged. A quiet man by reputation, he is today largely forgotten, overshadowed by louder figures and more explosive events. Yet he left behind something more durable than gold, a series of deeply esoteric alchemical texts that, if not always comprehensible, were endlessly studied. To understand Zosimos, one must understand Alexandria, not only the city's physical grandeur, but also its intellectual climate. By the time Zosimos was writing, the great library had suffered multiple calamities, but pockets of learning survived. Egyptian temples still functioned, albeit under siege by encroaching Christianity and Roman rule. The city's intellectual elite was still puzzling over the mysteries of matter and spirit. Zosimos, trained in both Egyptian temple tradition and Greek philosophy, bridged the old and the new. But this was not the exciting alchemy of later centuries, full of explosions and philosopher's stones. Zosimos' work was slower, drier, more symbolic. He described distillation equipment in painstaking detail, annotated transformations of metals that unfolded over weeks, and dwelled on color changes in obscure compounds with religious reverence. His texts had names like the Final Book on Instruments and Furnaces and on the letter Omega. He was interested in transmutation, but not just of metals. For Zosimos, transformation was a spiritual exercise. He believed that turning base metals into noble ones was a metaphor for the purification of the soul. In his writings, furnaces became tombs, fire a tool of resurrection. The lead, copper, and tin being worked on the alchemist's table were not merely substances, they were spiritual symbols, containers of pneuma, the breath of divine life. In one of his surviving works, Zosimos recounts a dream. He is led into a temple where he sees a priest undergoing an alchemical procedure, being melted, dissected, purified, and resurrected. It is graphic, methodical, and metaphorical. The vision ends with the instruction: this is the process of becoming a spiritual being. Here, the line between chemistry and theology dissolved, just as Zosimos believed metals could. The technical aspects of his work reveal how early Egyptian tools and ingredients were preserved in spiritual practice. He describes instruments such as the karotakis, a type of sealed distillation vessel, likely descended from Egyptian temple labs used to prepare perfumes and embalming oils. He catalogs procedures to create white powders, red liquids, and waters that burn like fire, likely acids used in metallurgical processes. Yet he also clung to older symbols: the serpent devouring itself, our robber rose, the phoenix of cyclical death and rebirth, and elements personified as gods and spirits. He would have known about the Book of the Dead, about ritual purification in Egyptian funerary rites. These weren't metaphors to him, they were historical continuities. Zosimos also represents a shift in who held knowledge. Alchemy had been the secret property of priesthoods, deeply tied to temple rites. But by Zosimos' time, Egypt's temples were in decline. Papyrus scrolls moved from priests' hands into those of philosophers, ascetics, and wandering scholars. These men were not chemists in a modern sense, but they carried with them the tools of experimentation and a need to reconcile the material with the spiritual. He lived through a time of persecution and transition. Christianity was no longer an obscure cult. It was rapidly becoming the religion of empire. Pagan temples were being shut down. Egyptian hieroglyphs were falling out of use, and new forms of writing and thinking were taking their place. Zosimos, caught between these worlds, wrote in Greek but thought in Egyptian symbols. He did not resist change, but he filtered it through the alembic of tradition. Few copies of his work survived intact. His most famous text, the Visions of Zosimos, would survive in fragments, copied and translated by Arabic scholars centuries later. His influence would echo not in the empire he lived in, but in the Islamic Golden Age and later in Latin Europe. But in his own time, Zosimos was obscure, his work slow, methodical, and not widely read. His papyrus scrolls did not ignite revolutions, they collected dust. Yet he was perhaps the first to write alchemical procedures with both mystical and technical detail, attempting to codify what had previously been passed down orally or in riddles. He insisted that the alchemist must purify himself before purifying metals, that knowledge required suffering, patience, and spiritual vision. He compared the burning of metals to the burning away of sin. He believed transformation began within. Was he a priest, a philosopher, a scientist, a mystic? In truth, he was all of these and none of them entirely. His name is rarely taught, yet his fingerprints are found in the margins of manuscripts copied centuries later in Arabic, Syriac, and Latin. And somewhere deep in those transcriptions lies a question Zosimos never stopped asking. What if the secret to immortality was not in escaping death, but in understanding it, dissecting it, and distilling it into something purer? You're still seated in that flickering chamber of Alexandria, but now the light is different. The oil lamp is older, the papyrus crackles with age. And Zosimos, he is no longer writing. His hands are still, his thoughts passed on. What remains are his scrolls, brittle as old leaves, and his legacy carried not by emperors or popes, but by forgotten scribes and curious monks who read between the lines of fire and mercury. We now move forward, but not far. It is the 5th century CE. The Roman Empire is declining in the West, while Christianity begins to spread through every corridor of power. Alexandria is caught in religious upheaval. Theophilus, the bishop, has closed pagan temples. The famed Serapeum, a temple to Serapis, and once a great depository of learning, has been destroyed, its books scattered, its secrets buried. The city is not what it once was, and neither is science. But Zosimos' writings haven't vanished, they've traveled. Somewhere, likely in Syria, a monk or scholar has obtained copies of his scrolls. These Greek manuscripts, difficult and obscure, are copied painstakingly. The figures of distillation vessels, the lists of ingredients like cinnabar, sulfur, and natron, and the poetic visions of inner purification are preserved not because they are popular, but because they are curious, strange, even heretical. And that curiosity keeps them alive. These scribes may not understand all the symbolism, but they recognize a deeper pattern, a strange but compelling synthesis of Egyptian religious ritual, Hellenistic philosophical reasoning, and a kind of proto-science that refuses to separate matter from spirit. In one fragment attributed to Zosimos, the alchemical process is described with ritualistic solemnity. Take the red water and place it in the vessel of Hermes. Fire it for 3 days and nights. You will see the material change as the soul departs and is purified in air. When it returns, it will be white and full of light. It reads less like a recipe and more like scripture. This is where Zosimos' influence begins to mutate. In places like Edessa and Harran cities, with strong links to both Greek and Mesopotamian learning, scribes are translating his work into Syriac. The mysticism is retained, but the Egyptian elements become veiled or reinterpreted. The process of purification now takes on Christian overtones. Suffering becomes penance, distillation becomes moral refinement, and the rebirth of metals is read through a theological lens. But there is also another thread, one leading toward more practical aims. Around this time, Zosimo's technical instructions begin to influence craftsmen who work with dyes, pigments, and metallurgy. His instructions on using mercury, for instance, allow for experimentation with amalgams, methods of joining precious metals with base ones to create stronger alloys. Whether intentionally or not, Zosimo's dream of spiritual transformation is giving birth to mundane technologies. Better tools, stronger blades, more durable ornamentation. Meanwhile, deep in the deserts of Egypt, the temples that once supported the old sciences fall into ruin. The priests are gone. The language of hieroglyphs becomes extinct. And yet, some of their secret recipes, the preparation of natron, the refinement of ochre, the precise blending of resins and gums continue, filtered through generations of artisans and preserved in monastic workshops. By the 6th century, an important shift occurs. Zosimos is increasingly invoked by name not as a philosopher or a priest, but as a chemist. His identity changes in the manuscripts, his theology thins. In one Syriac fragment, he is referred to simply as Zosimos, the man of knowledge who prepared the fire without flame. It is not reverence, it is practicality. And yet, his mysticism refuses to die. Let us take a brief look at the idea of the Ka, the Egyptian concept of the soul's vital essence. For Zosimos, alchemy was the working of the Ka through matter. This idea, once rooted in funerary rites and temple initiations, subtly influences Christian monastic thinking. When early ascetics speak of burning away the flesh to release the spirit, they are echoing the same principles, though they no longer call it Egyptian. The Syrian scribes keep copying. Into the 7th and 8th centuries, the manuscripts survive in small corners of monasteries and in personal collections. But a great change is coming. The Islamic conquests sweep through Egypt, Syria, and beyond, bringing with them a new energy and a deep respect for Greek knowledge. Baghdad, with its house of wisdom, becomes the center of this revival. By the 9th century, Zosimos is being translated again, this time into Arabic. It is in the Arabic world that he is reborn. His name is rendered as Zosimus or Zosima, and he becomes part of a broader alchemical canon. Islamic scholars, particularly those interested in the Hermetic tradition, view his works as sacred remnants of ancient wisdom. He is cited alongside Jabir ibn Hayyan and others, and many of his Greek phrases are transliterated directly, preserving their mystery. But now something interesting happens. Zosimos' work is no longer just preserved, it is dissected. Arabic scholars begin to separate the symbolic from the practical. They keep his vision of transformation but add commentary, clarification, and experimentation. They study his furnaces and improve them. They replicate his techniques and write down the results. They develop new substances, distilled alcohols, volatile acids, refined mercury compounds. In short, they begin to build a science. In this new context, Zosimos is no longer just an obscure mystic. He is a proto-chemist, a predecessor to scientific methodology. But even here, his symbolic visions remain powerful. Alchemical texts in Arabic frequently include imagery of death and resurrection, of purification through fire, and of cyclical transformation, clear echoes of Egyptian thought. One popular motif is that of the al-Ruh, the spirit, trapped in matter, awaiting release. Zosimos would have approved. Curiously, some texts even preserve his dream narrative, the melting of the body, the sacrifice, the rebirth. In an era dominated by reason and classification, these myths are not discarded. They are footnoted, contextualized, and sometimes embraced as metaphors for inner change. So what are we left with? Zosimos began as a lonely writer in a decaying Alexandria, describing strange dreams and obscure rituals. His scrolls were preserved by accident as much as by design. They passed through the hands of monks, scribes, translators, and scholars who barely understood them. And yet, with each new context, his ideas adapted. The original Egyptian world that birthed his thought temples, priesthoods, cosmologies of the dead was vanishing. But the essence of his work endured because it was flexible. It spoke to multiple audiences, to mystics, to ascetics, to artisans, and eventually to scientists. His influence would travel from Alexandria to Haran, from Edessa to Baghdad, and eventually to Andalusia and Latin Europe. He became a bridge not just between Egyptian and Greek thought, but between magic and science, mysticism and method. And still, one wonders, did Zosimos know that his scrolls, dusty, cryptic, and largely ignored, would one day help shape the birth of modern chemistry? Or did he write only for himself, believing that the greatest transformations begin in silence, hidden like mercury in a sealed flask? You find yourself now not in Egypt, nor in Syria, but in a damp, candle-lit scriptorium somewhere in southern Italy in the early 12th century. The wind rustles through narrow windows as a monk leans over a cracked vellum page, slowly copying a line from a strange and ancient text. He who knows the spirit of Mercury shall know the soul of the world. The monk doesn't understand all the words. Some are in Greek, others are poorly transliterated from Arabic, but the name at the top of the manuscript catches his eye, Zosimos. It appears alongside other names he's seen before, Hermes Trismegistus, Jabir, Morianus. He does not know it yet, but he is helping reintroduce Zosimos Alexandria's quiet alchemist into Latin Europe. The legacy of Zosimos would have faded entirely if not for this fragile chain of translation, transmission, and interpretation. Now, in the High Middle Ages, his texts are resurfacing in fragmented form, stitched together from Arabic, Greek, and Syriac sources, most often through the work of translators in places like Toledo and Sicily. These translators, Gerard of Cremona, Robert of Chester, and others, were neither mystics nor scientists in the modern sense. They were men of letters, driven by a belief that ancient knowledge, particularly from the East, held truths long obscured. They had little idea that what they were handling was not Greek science alone, but a palimpsest of Egyptian theology, Gnostic visions, and temple rituals disguised as chemistry. In these translations, Zosimos appears as a ghost. He is often quoted, but rarely fully understood. His procedures are included in Latin treatises like the Rosarium Philosophorum and Aurora Consurgens. His visions of sacrifice, purification, and the soul's journey through the fires of transformation are folded into broader Christian allegories. Even his technical ideas are altered. The Karotachis, for example, is misunderstood as a kind of sealed tomb or crucible of resurrection. Latin alchemists, unfamiliar with the temple workshops of Egypt, interpret his tools as metaphysical instruments. The symbolic and the scientific blur even further. The symbolic images in these manuscripts, lions devouring the sun, green dragons, twin-headed eagles, often echo the visual metaphors Zosimos introduced, though they are filtered through newer, often Christianized frameworks. A serpent consuming its own tail, a Ouroboros, becomes a popular emblem of eternity and the alchemical cycle. Few know that it likely passed into European consciousness through Zosimos and his Egyptian inheritance. But again, Zosimos is not central. He is footnoted, copied without attribution, repackaged. His original Greek texts are no longer accessible. Only paraphrased versions, buried in patchwork collections, remain. His name surfaces only in passing. Yet the influence persists. Even the slow, meticulous tone of Zosimos echoes through medieval manuscripts. His descriptions of gradual change, color shifts, temperature stages, and the soul's journey through flame set a model for how alchemical procedures would be written. not as lab reports but as pilgrimages. In one Latin manuscript, the Turba Philosophorum, the voice of Zosimos appears likely apocryphal but speaking with familiarity. He who would become gold must first be burned, divided, dissolved, and reformed. What is true of metal is true of man. That one sentence would echo for centuries. By the 14th century, alchemy in Europe had become both widespread and controversial. It was no longer the exclusive domain of scholars. It attracted frauds, dreamers, court advisors, and even kings. Some alchemists sought literal gold. Others pursued mystical enlightenment. A few, the most curious, began to recover slowly the connection between transformation and knowledge. Zosimos becomes a symbol again not just of ancient wisdom, but of lost knowledge. Renaissance humanists begin scouring manuscripts for older, purer sources. In the 15th century, when Marsilio Ficino and others begin translating the Hermetic corpus, a set of mystical texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, Zosimos is often mentioned in the same breath. He is understood as part of the same spiritual scientific tradition, though again, few read him directly. And then, in a quiet shift, the scientific revolution begins to stir. By the 17th century, thinkers like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton engage with alchemy not in public, but privately in notebooks and marginalia. Newton, in particular, devotes hundreds of pages to alchemical texts, including ones that trace their lineage back to Zosimos. He believes that within these symbolic procedures lies a divine truth, a hidden code embedded in nature. Still, Zosimos himself remains obscure. His name is a whisper in footnotes, a fragment in a web of citations. He is mentioned in passing by historians of chemistry, noted for being one of the first to describe actual laboratory techniques: distillation, sublimation, calcination, but rarely is his deeper vision explored. And yet, through all this, his original question persists. Zosimos never claimed that metals held the secret to eternal life. He claimed that the process of working with them did. That alchemy was a mirror showing the transformation of the soul through patient labor, purification, and release. This vision would quietly survive. In monasteries, in manuscripts, in modern psychology. Carl Jung in the 20th century would reintroduce Zosimos to a new audience. To Jung, alchemy was a symbolic system of inner transformation, and Zosimos' dream of the priest being purified in fire was a mythic representation of the human psyche confronting itself. Jung would write, "In Zosimos we find not chemistry but spiritual labor, not formulas but metaphors, not gold but the soul." So what can we say in the end of Zosimos of Panopolis? He did not discover the philosopher's stone. He did not found a school or spark a revolution. His writings were dense, obscure, and often misunderstood, but they endured through centuries of turmoil, through the fall of empires, through religious purges and changing languages. They endured because, beneath their symbols, they offered something deeper, a model of resilience. The slow art of transformation, the belief that knowledge is built one symbol at a time, the quiet conviction that understanding the material world is inseparable from understanding the self. Zosimos did not write for fame. He wrote for continuity, for the scroll, the fire, the dream. And perhaps that's why, even now, his question lingers. If knowledge is fire, then how much must we burn before we are purified enough to see? Story 2. Scribes, Spells, and Science in Late Dynastic Egypt. You are standing in the late afternoon sun on the edge of an ancient Egyptian temple complex. There are no tourists here, no grand ceremonies. The priests are tired. The Nile floods as it always has, but the world around is changing. Persia has come and gone. Greece is stirring. Rome will soon march in. But inside the temple, a different kind of work continues. The room you now imagine is not open to the public. It is called the Per-Ankh, the House of Life. Hidden within the temple precinct, it was no single room, but a complex of libraries, scriptoriums, and workspaces. It functioned as a scholarly, magical, and medical center, a hybrid of monastery, archive, hospital, and laboratory. This was the real infrastructure of ancient Egyptian knowledge. And though the grandeur of pyramids and pharaohs captures the imagination, it was here, in the quiet copying of texts and the slow preparation of unguents, that Egypt preserved and transmitted its deepest secrets. In late dynastic Egypt, especially between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE, this work became more urgent than ever. The priests in these houses were not simply religious figures. They were scribes, healers, astronomers, and pharmacologists. Their education began early. Boys trained for years in scribal schools, learning to copy the flowing lines of hieratic script and memorize the thousands of symbols in the sacred hieroglyphic canon. In the House of Life, writing was more than communication, it was a sacred technology. The texts they copied ranged widely: spells for the afterlife, medical treatises on broken bones and stomach ailments, almanacs for agricultural planting, hymns to the gods, and esoteric astronomical calculations. One might find on a single shelf a copy of the Book of the Dead, a manual for embalming, and a tablet describing the phases of the moon in connection with healing rituals. These institutions were not public. Access was restricted, and their very existence was rarely described in popular inscriptions. Much of what we know comes from archaeological hints, lists of temple equipment, letters between priests, and occasional Greek or Roman accounts. One of the best-known examples of a functioning house of life is in the temple complex at Abydos, where records suggest a combination of spiritual and medical knowledge was kept. Another stood in the Temple of Horus at Edfu, with rooms devoted to script copying and magical formulae preparation. In Memphis and Thebes, too, houses of life quietly maintained traditions that would one day be copied into Coptic and Arabic texts. But what exactly did these scribes and priests do? First, they copied. The survival of any Egyptian knowledge depended on the replication of texts. Papyrus, while relatively durable in Egypt's dry climate, was fragile in the long term. Texts were recopied every few generations, often revised slightly, corrected, or harmonized with evolving religious ideas. Scribes used reed brushes and carbon ink to copy scrolls, often taking great pains to include color, structure, and ritual order. Mistakes were not tolerated. Texts, especially those deemed sacred, had to be perfect. A wrong word in a healing spell might mean spiritual failure or physical death. Second, they compiled. The late period saw a rise in compilation texts, large scrolls combining older fragments into new, more systematic manuals. This reflected both a desire to preserve knowledge and a sense that the tradition itself was under threat. Egypt was no longer isolated. Libyan dynasties, Nubian kings, and Assyrian conquerors had all made their mark. Knowledge needed to be safeguarded, structured, and systematized. Some scrolls from this period read like encyclopedias. One might list dozens of diseases and their treatments, followed by chapters on dream interpretation, omens, and ritual days. Another might describe how to prepare a divine essence for use in temple rites, a mixture of oils, minerals, and invocations that could only be handled by purified hands. Third, they experimented. Although the modern concept of a laboratory did not yet exist, the House of Life had rooms for preparation of inks, incense, embalming oils, and medical pastes. Recipes were tested, refined, and recorded. Some rooms functioned almost like pharmacies, with rows of shelves filled with ingredients: natron salts, myrrh, galena, beeswax, lotus resin, copper ore, and crushed malachite. The preparation of incense was particularly significant. One scroll from the temple at Edfu contains over 60 recipes for incense alone, each for a different ritual or deity. The exact blending of cinnamon, frankincense, and rare gums from Nubia was not merely a matter of smell, it had cosmic significance. Smoke was seen as a vehicle for the soul or prayer to ascend. Fourth, they healed. Medicine in ancient Egypt was deeply tied to both empirical observation and religious belief. Some houses of life trained temple doctors who combined surgical knowledge with magical incantations. A wound might be treated with honey and willow bark, but always with a spell to invoke protection from Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of healing and plague. Medical texts from this period are surprisingly systematic. They describe symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments in structured format. For example, if you examine a man with a burning in the belly and his eyes are yellow, say, it is a sickness of the liver. Treat with dried figs and beer of dates. Apply a compress of clay from the east bank of the Nile. These were not guesses, they were observations passed down for generations, refined by practice and ritual. The survival of this system was remarkable, given the pressures of the time. By the 4th century BCE, the arrival of the Persians and, later, the Greeks under Alexander would transform Egypt's religious and political landscape. Yet even as temples were restructured and hieroglyphs began to wane, the scribes in the houses of life continued their work. In fact, some of their knowledge was quietly absorbed into Greek medicine and magic. The Greek word chemia, the root of alchemy, likely comes from the Egyptian word chem, meaning black, a reference to the fertile black soil of the Nile. Greek physicians who studied in Alexandria or Memphis often recorded Egyptian cures and rituals, adapting them into their own frameworks. But perhaps the most important legacy of the House of Life was not scientific or magical, it was psychological. In an era of upheaval, these institutions became sanctuaries of continuity. They preserved language, memory, and ritual. They kept the past alive in ink and scrolls, even as the world changed. They whispered to the future, here is what we knew, here is what we saw, don't forget. And yet there is still a mystery. Despite their importance, almost no complete house of life has been found by archaeologists. We have fragments, references, and scattered texts, but not the full picture. What rooms have we missed? What scrolls lie crumbled beneath the desert sand? What cures, cosmologies, and quiet practices have we lost forever? Did the final scribes, writing under fading lamplight, know they were the last? Or did they believe, as always, that the next generation would copy their scrolls, light the incense, and remember? The House of Life per Ankh was never built to impress outsiders. Unlike temples with their towering pylons or tombs carved deep into stone, these structures hid behind thick walls and quiet corridors. They were less about grandeur and more about function, places of thinking, recording, preparing. But now, in the shadow of empire, their role begins to shift. We are in the 4th century BCE. Egypt has changed hands yet again. The Persians have been expelled, and Alexander the Great has swept through the region like a desert storm. In his wake comes the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek rulers who adopt Egyptian customs but speak a different language and worship in new ways. Alexandria rises on the coast, a new kind of city, international and intellectual. And yet, despite all this transformation, the houses of life still operate, quietly, diligently. Though they are no longer supported with the same grandeur as in dynasties past, they continue to preserve Egypt's deepest traditions. Some scholars suggest that during the early Ptolemaic period, these houses functioned in partnership with new Greek institutions. The famous Library of Alexandria, though different in tone and method, may have drawn from the temple archives, requesting copies of scrolls preserved in these secluded precincts. What a contrast that would have been. On one side, sleek Greek scribes translating Homer and Euclid into polished Greek scripts. On the other, Egyptian priests in the back rooms of old temples, carefully copying the ritual of embalming or the book of breathing onto worn papyrus, using signs already ancient in their day. There was tension, certainly. The Ptolemies ruled with tolerance but not equality. Greek was the language of administration and science. Egyptian was relegated to the sacred and rural. But still, the scribes wrote. They continued not because they were favored, but because they believed that the world depended on memory, that order was maintained through ritual, writing, and preservation. By the 2nd century BCE, A curious hybrid begins to appear in Egyptian scholarship, the Demotic magical papyri. Written in the cursive Demotic script, these scrolls combine traditional Egyptian spells with Greek elements and Hellenistic astrology. A scribe might record a spell invoking Thoth and Isis, but also call upon Greek deities, planetary hours, or invocations in Greek phonetics. These were not random additions. They reflect a slow blending of worldviews. Egypt was not isolated, it was absorbing. The priests knew that to survive, their knowledge had to shift, adapt, incorporate. What was once strictly ritual became increasingly experimental. Astrology fused with healing, numerology with medicine, Hellenistic philosophy with native theology. One Demotic papyrus, known today as the London Leiden Papyrus, is especially revealing. It contains recipes for invisibility, love spells, and cures for snake bites set alongside instructions for summoning protective spirits and interpreting dreams. It is both magical and medical, both religious and pragmatic. But what does this tell us about the House of Life? It shows that even in decline, these institutions remained intellectually active. They weren't frozen in the past. They experimented, translated, hybridized. The scrolls they produced were practical tools for priests, doctors, and magicians working under new rules. And they carried forward traditions that had begun 1,000 years earlier, sometimes using the very same words. Take, for instance, the continued use of color symbolism in healing and ritual. Red, associated with danger and Set, was used to drive out illness. Green, the color of rebirth, and Osiris signaled healing. These associations appeared in medicine, amulets, painting, and potion-making, subtle but ever-present. It wasn't just decoration. It was coding embedded knowledge preserved through centuries of scribal training. In addition, the process of copying itself became a spiritual act. To copy a sacred scroll was to recreate a piece of divine order. The scribe, bent over his writing board, was not merely recording, he was participating in creation. The act of inscription echoed the myth of Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, who spoke the world into balance. The pressure to maintain this tradition increased in the Roman period, when temple patronage declined sharply. Many rural temples collapsed, their libraries looted or neglected. Scrolls were hidden, buried, or left in desert caches. Some priests, fearing loss, began to encode texts to make them harder to misuse by outsiders. These efforts, however desperate, preserved fragments that would survive into later eras. When the last hieroglyph was carved in the 4th century CE on the temple at Philae, the ancient script was already unintelligible to most. The chain had been broken, but within the houses of life, centuries before that moment, there had been an understanding that knowledge might sleep, but it must never be lost. So where did it go? Some knowledge was absorbed by Christian monks, who inherited temple sites and sometimes copied Egyptian herbal lore into Greek. Other fragments traveled into early Arabic medical and magical texts. Still others, especially those on astronomy and cosmology, were hidden in the margins of Coptic scrolls, buried beneath layers of changing script and language. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the House of Life was its method, its calm, repetitive insistence on recording, on preserving, on the belief that even in the face of empire, collapse, and change, words written with care could carry meaning beyond their time. In that sense, the House of Life wasn't just a building, it was a philosophy. It whispered, copy the spell, record the cure, annotate the ritual, you may be the last or the bridge to another beginning. And so we are left with a question. When an entire civilization entrusts its soul to scrolls and symbols, how many generations of scribes must disappear before its memory becomes myth? You are now far from the Nile, far from the temple walls, and far from the scent of ink and burning incense. Centuries have passed. The sand has covered much. The papyrus has rotted. The houses of life have been abandoned, their names lost even to local memory. and yet the echoes of what they preserved have not disappeared entirely. This is the afterlife of knowledge, the slow journey of ideas across languages, religions, and empires. The scribes of the House of Life never imagined digital archives, scientific journals, or psychological textbooks. Yet some of their core insights about healing, the mind, the cosmos, and the sacredness of recording knowledge have outlived their institutions. One thread of survival lies in Galenic medicine. Greek physicians like Galen and Dioscorides, writing centuries after the golden age of the Egyptian houses of life, incorporated practical Egyptian remedies and methods into their own texts. Whether through direct transmission or through observation of Egyptian practitioners under Roman rule, certain herbal cures, preparation methods, and anatomical observations filtered into the Greco-Roman medical corpus. These works, translated into Arabic in the Abbasid era, carried whispers of Egyptian thought across continents. Islamic physicians such as al-Razi and Ibn Sina studied Galenic texts and added their own insights, some of which had roots in temple medicine balms made from black cumin, uses of honey and myrrh, even pulse diagnosis, which appeared in both Egyptian and later Greco-Arabic contexts. But the trail is not only in medicine. In the realm of magic, Egyptian influence is far clearer. The so-called Greek magical papyri, a cache of texts written in Greek, Coptic, and Demotic from the 2nd century BCE to the 5th century CE, preserve incantations, spells, and ritual instructions that clearly trace their lineage to the houses of life. One such spell, for protection against illness, invokes not only Greek gods but also Horus, Thoth, and Isis. It requires the practitioner to inscribe signs on papyrus using a mixture of red ochre and wine, methods nearly identical to those described in older temple texts. Even the use of the written word as a magical tool, a belief central to Egyptian theology, survives in these later papyri. Words, once inscribed with precision, became talismans in themselves. The houses of life trained generations of scribes to believe in the power of writing not as record, but as ritual. Some scrolls were practical, treatments for snake bites or eye infections. Others were deeply symbolic, instructions for the soul's journey through the underworld, filled with gates, guardians, and recitations that ensured safe passage. The boundary between science and spirituality was never sharply drawn. A cure for illness might involve both herbal compresses and chants to a god. A diagnosis could be informed by both physical symptoms and the interpretation of dreams or omens. These were not contradictions, they were part of a holistic worldview where the seen and unseen, the measurable and the mysterious, worked together. And while modern science has largely discarded this unity, elements remain. Today, we can trace ancient Egyptian plant-based medicines to active compounds validated by chemistry. We know that honey has antimicrobial properties, that willow bark contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin, and that copper has antiseptic uses. What Egyptian priests intuited through observation and experience is now explained through molecular science. But something else remains, something less tangible. The act of recording knowledge with care. The houses of life were driven by the belief that the world could be understood through writing, that chaos could be fended off by order, and that the preservation of knowledge was a sacred duty not only for the benefit of the living, but for the dead, and for those yet to come. Even the architecture of their workspaces reflected this. Rooms were aligned with the stars. Rituals governed when texts could be copied. Scribes were purified before handling sacred scrolls. It was not superstition, it was discipline. It was a worldview where knowledge was not just practical, but cosmically significant. This same reverence for preservation would re-emerge in later religious traditions. Medieval monasteries in Europe would adopt similar rituals of copying and prayer. Islamic libraries in Baghdad and Cairo would embrace the sacredness of writing. Even Renaissance humanists, rediscovering the power of texts, would approach ancient manuscripts with awe. What they did not know was that the model had already existed in a dry room behind a temple wall, where a priest lit a lamp, opened a scroll, and began again the careful work of remembering. Today, few intact records from the houses of life remain. The papyrus has decayed. The scrolls were buried, reused, or burned. But every so often, archaeologists uncover a fragment, a list of herbs, a partial hymn, a diagram of the human body. In museums and archives, these scraps sit under glass, studied in silence. Yet they speak, not loudly but insistently. They remind us that science does not begin with certainty, it begins with repetition, observation, belief, and long hours of quiet study. The houses of life understood this. They practiced slow knowledge, knowledge that grows across centuries, passed from hand to hand, imperfect but enduring. And so we ask, if knowledge is a kind of immortality, then have the scribes of the house of life already achieved the very afterlife they wrote so carefully about? Story 3. Alchemy in the Abbey, how monks preserved Egyptian transmutation. Picture a cool morning mist settling over the rolling hills of northern Italy, or perhaps the damp marshlands of coastal Gaul. A solitary bell tolls from the cloister tower, echoing across the fields. Inside the stone walls of a Benedictine monastery, a hooded figure leans over a wooden table. There is no crowd, no congregation, only silence, flickering candlelight, and the quiet hiss of a flame under a blackened crucible. The year is perhaps 860 CE. The place is remote, sacred, and sequestered. But what is happening inside this monastery is not merely prayer or copying scripture, it is something older, stranger, something whispered across centuries. It is the slow, deliberate continuation of Egyptian alchemy preserved, translated, reinterpreted in the cold stone chambers of Christian Europe. Alchemy in the early medieval period was not practiced openly. It carried no prestige. The great classical civilizations had crumbled. Rome had fallen. The libraries were destroyed, forgotten, or abandoned. And yet, despite all of this, fragments of Egyptian Greek alchemical knowledge survived hidden in manuscripts, encoded in Christian allegory, preserved through ritual more than reason. The question is how? The answer begins with translation. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, most scientific and philosophical texts from antiquity were no longer copied. Literacy declined outside of religious contexts, but within monastic walls, a new class of literate individuals emerged: monks. Their daily lives revolved around ora et labora, prayer and labor. Much of that labor involved copying books. At first, these were religious texts, the Psalms, the Gospels, the Rule of Saint Benedict. But in time, scribes began copying secular and even pagan works, medical treatises, calendars, agricultural manuals, and yes, alchemical texts. Some of these came from Latin translations of Greek originals, possibly drawn from Roman libraries that had survived in fragments. Others had passed through the Arabic world and entered Europe through the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily during early contact with Islamic culture. These translations were incomplete, often misunderstood, and sometimes heavily edited to remove overt references to ancient gods. Yet they retained strange, recurring motifs: metals that die and are reborn, secret fires, colored vapors, and the idea that lead, properly transformed, could become gold, and the soul, properly purified, could ascend. The monks did not call it alchemy at first. They referred to it in cautious terms: ars transmutationis, the art of change, or ars sacra, the sacred art. It was sometimes hidden within texts that ostensibly dealt with medicine or Christian mysticism. A recipe for treating fevers might, upon closer inspection, involve elaborate instructions for calcining a mineral and invoking a spirit of purification. Why would monks, devoted to a new religion, preserve a discipline born in the temples of ancient Egypt? Because they recognized something familiar. Early Christian theology was not born in isolation. It had grown in Egypt, Syria, and Palestine regions steeped in Greek and Egyptian thought. Church fathers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria were trained in Platonic and Hermetic schools of interpretation. To them, allegory was the key to all truth. A story was never just a story. A ritual was never just a performance. It had layers. And alchemy, with its symbols and transformations, fit this worldview perfectly. Take the idea of purification through fire. In Egyptian alchemy, fire was the agent of transformation. It burned away impurity and revealed the divine essence. In Christian monasticism, fire became a metaphor for spiritual trial. The monastery itself was a crucible, isolation, fasting, and labor as tools of purification. Thus, the monks who quietly experimented with red earths, mercury, and wine distillations were not always breaking with theology, they were extending it. Many of the early texts that circulated during this period were unattributed. Others were falsely ascribed to biblical figures, Solomon, Moses, or even Adam. These pseudepigraphic strategies allowed monks to copy and explore alchemical material under the guise of sacred ancestry. The belief was simple: if the knowledge was ancient, it must be holy. One of the earliest Latin alchemical texts to survive is known as the Physica et Mystica, attributed to Pseudo-Democritus. It is a strange, dreamlike text, full of procedures for creating divine water and descriptions of materials that speak during transformation. Later, a work called Mappi Clavicula, literally, the little key of the secrets, compiled in the 9th century, contains dozens of recipes for coloring glass, refining metals, and preparing pigments. Some are purely practical, others hint at something more. For instance, take the red salt and mix it with the blessed oil. Place it in a vessel and heat it until it cries. Then cool it and bury it under the earth for 3 days. When it is dug up, it will shine like the sun. To the untrained eye, it might seem poetic. To those with knowledge of Egyptian and Hellenistic texts, it is recognizable as a spiritualized distillation and sublimation process. The vessels they used were crude compared to Alexandrian Karotakis devices, but the principle remained: transformation through controlled, sacred fire. There is no evidence that these monks succeeded in making gold. That was never really the point. The goal, particularly in early monastic alchemy, was spiritual reflection through material engagement. The fire of the crucible became a mirror for the monk's own soul. The slow transformation of base substances into shining metal mirrored the monk's transformation from flawed man to purified vessel of God. It was, in essence, a continuation of Egyptian theology dressed in Christian robes. Even the materials were similar. Many monasteries had gardens where medicinal herbs were cultivated: mint, fennel, rue. But the monks also collected minerals: antimony, sulfur, cinnabar, verdigris, and copper salts. These were ground and mixed, often in mortars carved with crosses, their usage half medicinal, half mystical. The rituals, too, bore traces of the past. Just as Egyptian priests fasted before entering sacred spaces, monks observed periods of silence and purification before undertaking certain alchemical tasks. Prayers were said before lighting flames. The laboratory became a sacred cell, an echo of temple purification chambers repurposed for the Christian world. We cannot say for certain how much the monks understood the Egyptian roots of what they practiced. Most had never seen hieroglyphs, but the structure of their rituals, the language of transformation, and the deep sense that spiritual truth could be found in the manipulation of matter, these all point to a living, if unconscious, inheritance. By the 11th century, these early experiments would begin to converge with fresh translations arriving from Arabic Spain. The reintroduction of Zosimo's writings, now in Arabic, would add a new dimension to monastic alchemy. But before that moment, before the awakening of scholastic Europe, the seed of Egyptian alchemy had already been preserved. It survived not through dramatic revelation or scientific breakthrough, but through candlelight, ink, and quiet repetition. So we ask, what did those monks see, staring into their flickering vessels? Did they glimpse gold or something older, deeper, waiting in the fire for its next form? You're still inside the monastery, but the centuries have turned. It is now the late 11th or early 12th century. The world beyond the stone walls is stirring with movement and exchange. Crusaders cross eastward through Byzantine lands. Trade routes stretch into Islamic Spain and North Africa. And with this movement, a quiet revolution is happening not in the fields, nor in the churches, but in the scriptoria and libraries where ink-stained monks copy unfamiliar names into Latin. Names like Zosimos, Jabir ibn Hayyan, Khalid ibn Yazid, and Belinas. Names that would soon become woven into the growing corpus of medieval alchemical literature. This period marks a turning point in the story of how Egyptian alchemy, filtered through Greek and Arabic translations, entered and transformed European thought. The abbey, once a site of isolated ritual and preservation, becomes part of a much larger network of knowledge transmission. Let us begin in Spain. After the Islamic conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century, Muslim rulers established cities like Cordoba and Toledo as vibrant centers of learning. There, scholars collected Greek texts preserved and expanded upon in the Islamic world: Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, and yes, alchemical treatises by Greek figures like Zosimos and Pseudo-Democritus. The Arabic translators had done more than preserve these texts. They had commented on them, improved them, added insights from their own experiments. Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Latin as Geber, wrote extensively on distillation, sublimation, and the theory of balance in all things. The idea that each substance had hot, cold, wet, and dry qualities. These ideas were grounded in both Greek natural philosophy and Islamic metaphysical frameworks, but also bore the unmistakable imprint of earlier Egyptian concepts. The transmutation of the soul, the purification of matter, and the idea that metals matured like living things, these were not Islamic inventions. They were inherited traditions, shaped centuries earlier in the smoky rooms of the Egyptian houses of life and the dreaming scrolls of Zosimos. Now these texts were entering Latin Europe. Toledo in the 12th century became a translation hub. There, Christian scholars, often working with Jewish and Muslim intermediaries, translated Arabic alchemical texts into Latin. One of the most important of these was Gerard of Cremona, who translated over 70 works, including many on alchemy. Others, like Robert of Chester, translated Arabic versions of older Greek works, giving Latin Europe its first direct contact with Zosimos and related thinkers. These translations were not always accurate. Sometimes the metaphors were misunderstood. At other times, deliberate Christian reinterpretation took place. But they ignited curiosity. In monastic centers like Monte Cassino and Cluny, monks who had preserved early Latin alchemical fragments now found themselves copying more complex and systematic works. Procedures for making acids, instructions for purifying mercury, and discussions of the elusive elixir, a substance believed to perfect both metals and the soul, began appearing alongside biblical commentaries and saintly hagiographies. The transformation was subtle but profound. Alchemy, once veiled in spiritual metaphor, began to take on more technical dimensions. The monks' crucibles and flasks were no longer just symbols, they became tools of experimentation. Recipes from Arabic texts described precise measurements, temperatures, and timing. The practice became increasingly empirical, though still wrapped in religious allegory. Take, for example, the emergence of the term lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. This was not just a physical substance. To some, it was Christ himself, the purified cornerstone of faith. To others, it was a literal red powder, created through the purification of base matter via repeated calcination, dissolution, and coagulation. Egyptian and Hellenistic texts had long described this kind of substance, often in symbolic terms. Now, in monastic Europe, it was becoming a focal point of scientific and spiritual inquiry. And still, echoes of Zosimo's could be heard. In a 12th century Latin text called Liber de Arte Chemica, we find passages that paraphrase his visions. The soul suffers in fire, yet by fire it is reborn. One must be broken to be made whole. That which is black becomes white, that which is white becomes red, and in redness is perfection. The color progression black negrito, white albedo, red rubido would become a foundational sequence in medieval and later Renaissance alchemy. But its origins can be traced back to the Egyptian symbolism of death, purification, and rebirth. The blackened corpse, the purified bones, the golden resurrection. It was, in essence, the Book of the Dead rewritten in mineral terms. Some monks embraced the literal, others the allegorical. A monk might spend a decade preparing what he believed was the universal solvent, only to discover a red powder that stained but did not transmute. And yet, failure did not discourage him. The act of trying, of refining, of purifying this was the work of salvation. Indeed, monastic alchemy was as much about the inner life as the outer world. Writings from this period frequently describe the alchemical vessel as the vas hermeticum, the sealed flask, within which matter is broken down and made whole again. The monk himself is a vessel, the fire is his trial. The dissolution of metals is his own dying to the self, and when the elixir is finally revealed, if it ever is, it is not just gold, but grace. Even the physical environment of the monastery contributed to this worldview. The cloister garden provided herbs, the apothecary held mineral stores, the scriptorium offered access to rare texts, and the silence of monastic life allowed for the kind of sustained attention needed for both prayer and experimentation. Time was measured not in hours, but in chance and seasons. The alchemical process, which could take weeks or months, aligned naturally with this rhythm. Still, there was danger. The church hierarchy did not always approve of alchemy, especially when it veered toward material gain. Some monks were accused of sorcery or heresy. Others operated in secret, their laboratories hidden behind shelves or beneath cellars. To practice openly, one had to frame the work as Theologia Naturalis, natural theology. Alchemy was to be a meditation on God's order in the world, not a quest for wealth or power. And yet beneath these careful declarations, something older stirred. The smoke that curled from monastery chimneys was not so different from the incense that once rose in the temples of Edfu and Dendera. The scrolls of copper salts and divine fire, once held in the hands of Egyptian priests, now lay open on monastic tables, rewritten in Latin but resonant with ancient meaning. So we must ask, when monks transmuted lead into something more noble, were they copying the secrets of the pharaohs? Or were they, unknowingly, becoming the last alchemists of a world they thought they had left behind? The monastery is quiet again. The bell for vespers has tolled. The crucible is cooling, its contents wrapped in silence. The monk, his fingers stained red from cinnabar, and copper oxide wipes his hands on a cloth already heavy with alchemical history. The fire has gone out, but the experiment continues in another form. It is the 13th century now, and alchemy in Europe has taken on a strange double life. In the monasteries, it remains a sacred discipline, closely guarded and privately practiced. In cities, however, in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, it is becoming fashionable among scholars, physicians, and even nobles. But in all its forms, it still carries the imprint of the Egyptian world that gave it birth. The Egyptian spirit of alchemy never relied on speed, spectacle, or profit. It was a long game, quiet, methodical, deeply symbolic, and that spirit persisted in the abbeys, even as the practice spread outward. Let us consider the figures who emerged during this time. Among them, Roger Bacon, an English Franciscan monk who dabbled in optics, languages, and alchemical theory. He believed that true alchemy could not be separated from theology. For Bacon, the world was a book, written by God in the language of nature. To study it was a holy task. Then there was Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, a Dominican friar and scholar who studied Aristotle and was said to have created a philosopher's stone. He denied the rumors, of course, but in his writings, he emphasized the spiritual dimension of transmutation, that metals matured like people, that nature was God's laboratory, and that human intervention could, if done piously, complete what nature had left unfinished. Even more influential was Thomas Aquinas, Albert's student, who never practiced alchemy himself, but defended its study as long as it aimed at understanding, not greed. These men stood on the edge of a transformation. Their ideas, shaped in the quiet of monasteries, helped shift alchemy from a mystical art to an intellectual pursuit, but they also retained something of the old ways. Their writings speak of matter as alive, capable of suffering, capable of redemption. The influence of Egyptian cosmology, where metal had soul and color had meaning, was still alive. Meanwhile, new texts continued to arrive from the Arabic world. Works attributed to Jabir Geber, now deeply Christianized, spoke of the four elements earth, water, air, and fire, and the four qualities hot, cold, dry, and wet found in all substances. These principles were presented as keys to unlock transformation. But transformation was never just chemical, it was moral, spiritual. In one Latin manuscript from the 14th century, possibly written by a Carthusian monk, we find the following instruction. Before you begin the work, prepare thyself with prayer and fasting. The vessel must be sealed, as thy soul must be sealed from pride. The fire must be steady, as thy faith must be steady. If the work fails, let it be to thy betterment, for even failure purifies. The work refers, of course, to the magnum opus, the great work, the process of creating the philosopher's stone. But the metaphor is layered. The work is also the monk's life. The fire is trial, the vessel is the soul, and the stone is salvation. These were not scientists in the modern sense. They did not seek reproducible results. They were pilgrims, seeking signs. And in the crucible, in the vapors, in the shifting colors of heated copper and lead, they believed they were glimpsing truths far older than Christianity, truths first recorded on temple walls in Luxor and Thebes. The Egyptian worldview was based on Ma'at, balance, order, justice. Alchemy for them was the application of that principle to matter. The monks, though shaped by a different theology, shared the impulse. They too sought balance between heaven and earth, between purity and sin, between the mutable and the eternal. What survived from the houses of life was not just recipes or images of flasks and furnaces. It was a discipline of the mind, a reverence for secrecy, a patience with mystery, a belief that the material world, however base, could be made divine. And while monastic alchemy would eventually fade, replaced by scholastic natural philosophy, and later, by empirical science, its influence lingered in unexpected ways. When Isaac Newton, centuries later, spent nights decoding alchemical symbols and testing reactions, he worked not just from printed books, but from hand-copied manuscripts inherited from this very lineage. Newton owned texts by Zosimos, Albertus Magnus, and Geber. His notebooks are filled with references to green lions, red kings, and the lapis philosophorum. He saw no contradiction between gravity and transmutation. To him, both were expressions of divine order. So perhaps the monks had succeeded after all. They had not turned lead to gold. They had not conquered death. But they had preserved a tradition that was neither Greek nor Roman, neither Christian nor Muslim, but something more ancient, an Egyptian flame passed hand to hand, language to language, vessel to vessel. By the time alchemy turned into chemistry, the monasteries were no longer the center of that work. But they had served their purpose. They had kept the fire alive in an age of darkness. And in the end, their pursuit raises a quiet question, one that still lingers in our laboratories and libraries. If every transformation begins in silence, how much of what we call science today was born not in discovery, but in devotion. Story 4. The Emerald Tablet's Journey, from Hermopolis to Andalusia. The words are few, 17 short lines, no names, no dates, and yet for centuries they have commanded the attention of alchemists, mystics, philosophers, and scientists alike. Written in cryptic verse, they promise secrets hidden since the foundation of the world. That which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, to accomplish the miracle of the one thing. So reads the most famous line of what would come to be called the Emerald Tablet. But before it was translated into Latin, before it was etched into the imagination of Renaissance magi and Enlightenment chemists, the Emerald Tablet was a whisper, a fragment of Hermetic wisdom born in the cultural furnace of Egypt, likely in or near the ancient city of Hermopolis. And it begins, as so many of these stories do, in a place that no longer exists. Hermopolis, city of the moon and wisdom. Known in Egyptian as Khmunu, Hermopolis was dedicated to Thoth, god of writing, magic, and equilibrium. The Greeks, ever eager to syncretize, saw in Thoth their own Hermes, the messenger of the gods, the patron of language and transitions. But to merge him with Egyptian theology, they gave him new form, Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. A figure not merely divine but philosophical, a fusion of God, sage, and cosmic principle. Hermes Trismegistus was said to have written thousands of sacred texts, most of which were lost or imagined. But among the few that survived in scattered fragments, one stood apart, the Emerald Tablet. Its origins are murky. No complete Egyptian or Greek original has ever been found. Some scholars believe it was first written in Arabic during the 8th or 9th century CE, based on earlier, now lost texts from the late antique period. Others suggest it was a Greek philosophical poem, later translated and reshaped within the Islamic world. But its symbolism is unmistakably Hermetic and deeply Egyptian. Consider the structure: a mysterious green stone emerald, malachite, a metaphor, inscribed with sacred knowledge, a concise set of axioms about the unity of all things, the correspondence of macrocosm and microcosm, and the transformative power of a single, unnamed substance. These are not the concerns of metallurgy, they are the echoes of Egyptian temple cosmology. Where the Per-Ankh, the house of life, once recorded rituals for healing the body and guiding the soul, the Emerald Tablet distills the same truths into fewer words. It declares, without explanation, that everything originates from the one thing, that separation and recombination are keys to mastery, and that all transformations follow divine principles. This was no recipe, it was doctrine. And its journey was only beginning. The Arabic translation, between the lab and the divine. The first known version of the Emerald Tablet appears in Arabic sources in the 8th or 9th century, most notably in a text called the Kitab Sur al-Khalqa, the Book of the Secret of Creation, attributed to a legendary figure known as Belinas, often identified with Apollonius of Tyana. In this version, the tablet is said to have been found in a hidden chamber beneath a statue of Hermes in Egypt. The chamber, sealed by magic, could only be opened by the worthy. Within lay the tablet written in green stone, engraved with letters that shimmered like starlight. This origin myth is rich with Egyptian motifs, sealed tombs, magical inscriptions, and divine inheritance. It echoes the burial of sacred knowledge alongside kings, and the belief that true wisdom must be earned through trial. But the Arabic authors did not stop with mythology. They saw in the tablet a blueprint not only for spiritual unity, but for material transformation. In the hands of Islamic scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan, the tablet became part of a broader philosophical system. Jabir saw the one thing as the primal substance of the universe, what the Greeks called prima materia, and what the Egyptians may have described in the symbolic matter of Nun, the chaotic waters of creation. The tablet's instruction to separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, became a method for distillation. It was both alchemical technique and cosmological insight. Alchemy, as practiced in the Islamic world, was no mere quest for gold, it was a sacred science aimed at understanding divine unity. From Baghdad to Cairo, the Emerald Tablet was copied, commented upon, and embedded in larger treatises. Islamic philosophers like Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi examined its metaphysical implications. Meanwhile, practical alchemists built furnaces to replicate its commands. Its mysterious language, so simple, so elusive, allowed for both scientific and mystical readings. In this way, the tablet preserved its Egyptian essence. It remained, like the pyramids, both architectural and symbolic, a structure and a mystery. But it was not finished traveling. Arrival in the Latin West, from secret to obsession. By the early 12th century, Latin translations of Arabic texts began to flow into Europe through the work of translators in places like Toledo, Sicily, and southern France. Among them was the Emerald Tablet. One of the earliest Latin versions appears in a treatise called the Liber de Secretis Naturae, Book of the Secrets of Nature, translated by Hugo of Santalla. The text is short, barely a page, but its impact was immense. Its first line reads, Verum sine mendatio, certum et verissimum. True, without falsehood, certain and most true. It was a declaration of faith in the power of nature's hidden design. European monks and scholars seized upon the tablet as a key to unlock the secrets of God's creation. They saw in it not a foreign text, but a divine message obscured by the ages. The phrase, as above, so below, resonated with Christian theology. It affirmed the harmony between heaven and earth, spirit and body, God and man. Alchemy, now fully reborn in the Latin world, began to organize itself around the tablet's cryptic lines. The 7 stages of alchemical work: calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, and coagulation were mapped onto the text. Diagrams were drawn. Commentaries were written. The tablet became an article of faith for alchemists from Roger Bacon to Isaac Newton. And yet through all these layers, the original voice, Egyptian, hermetic, cosmic, remained. Even those who did not understand its roots felt its gravity. To read the Emerald Tablet was to feel, however faintly, the breath of a civilization that viewed all things as connected, that saw the world not as mechanical, but alive. A stone that never was. It is worth noting, the Emerald Tablet may never have existed in stone form. There is no archaeological evidence of it. The earliest accounts are clearly allegorical. The name emerald likely refers to the color of transformation, of rebirth, green, the color of Osiris, the god of resurrection. Its physical form was a metaphor, as was its content. The tablet was not a tool but a mirror. It reflected back to the reader what they brought to it. To the mystic, it revealed divine unity. To the alchemist, a method. To the philosopher, a cosmology. To the Egyptian priest who first envisioned it, if there ever was one, it may have been a final condensation of a fading world. One last effort to encode the logic of the stars and the secrets of the tomb in a language short enough to survive the end of temples, kings, and gods. But still the question lingers. What truth can survive across empires, languages, and centuries if not carved in stone, then written in symbols so deep they outlast even their own meaning? The wind stirs through narrow streets in Toledo. The year is sometime in the mid-12th century. The city is bustling, a rare convergence of cultures under one skyline. Christian rulers hold power, but Islamic scholars still teach in the mosques, and Jewish scribes copy texts in quiet courtyards. It is here, in this layered city of tolerance and tension, that the Emerald Tablet begins its most transformative journey into the Latin world. In candle-lit alcoves of scriptoria, Christian translators like Gerard of Cremona, Robert of Chester, and Hugo of Santalla are hard at work. They have learned Arabic not for diplomacy, but for knowledge. And from these Arabic manuscripts, some copied centuries earlier in Baghdad or Cairo, they extract fragments of ancient science, including the enigmatic tabula smaragdina. It is this Latin name, the Emerald Tablet, that will now define it. Translated from Arabic into Latin, the tablet is short, composed of those same mysterious lines. 17 verses, no more, but its ambiguity is its strength. It is read by many, understood by none, and interpreted by all. It begins, Verum sine mendatio, certum et verissimum. It is true, without falsehood, certain and most true. The Latin scribes copy these words with care. They know this is not just another philosophical maxim, it is a declaration of a hidden reality. To them, the Emerald Tablet is not merely a relic from a foreign age. It is the key to a system of knowledge that unites heaven and earth, body and spirit, matter and meaning. But what they bring with them, without realizing it, is Egypt. Alchemy's Egyptian skeleton in a Christian cloak. By the 13th century, European scholars are quoting the tablet in commentaries, sermons, and secret experiments. Alchemy is no longer a curious branch of natural philosophy, it is becoming a serious subject of study, both practical and mystical. In abbeys and courts, Latin readers begin to associate the cryptic lines of the Emerald Tablet with the great work, the transmutation of base metals into gold, and the parallel purification of the human soul. Andalusian philosophers, especially those in Islamic Spain, had already made this connection. They preserved the Egyptian Hermetic idea that all matter is infused with divine potential, and that through proper understanding and labor, one could accelerate nature's own processes. This wasn't magic in the vulgar sense. It was seen as a science, one that required years of discipline, observation, prayer, and symbolic thinking. Thus, the Latin reception of the Emerald Tablet was shaped not only by translation, but by contextual reinterpretation. For example, the phrase, "Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity," was seen by some as instruction for distillation, a common laboratory procedure. To others, it was spiritual. The soul must be extracted from the body, purified and reunited. Likewise, it rises from earth to heaven and descends again to earth, thereby combining within itself the powers of both the above and the below. This line, perhaps the most Egyptian in tone, was read through Christian allegory. The incarnation of Christ, the descent of the Holy Spirit, or the return of grace to fallen man. But beneath these layers, the Egyptian foundations remained. The tablet's core ideas mirror Egyptian cosmology. Unity of all things. Egyptian religion held that the universe was born from a single source, the primordial waters of none. All things emerged from this, and all would return. Transformation through balance. The concept of mad or cosmic order emphasized balance between upper and lower Egypt, between life and death, between human and divine. Material as metaphor. In Egyptian ritual, incense, color, metal, and gesture all had symbolic significance. The Emerald Tablet's vague prescriptions echo this logic. The one thing is real but undefinable. These patterns persisted in Latin alchemy, though transformed. The rise of the Christian alchemical tradition. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Emerald Tablet had become embedded in a growing corpus of alchemical literature. It was quoted in major works like the Rosarium Philosophorum, Turba Philosophorum, and Aurora Consurgens. These texts, often written in dense, symbolic prose, made use of the tablet's structure, pairing chemical processes with spiritual allegory. In monasteries and urban workshops, alchemists pursued the magnum opus, the great work. The goal was not just to create gold, but to achieve union with the divine. Each step in the laboratory, calcination, dissolution, coagulation, was mirrored by a spiritual trial. Pride burned away, ignorance dissolved, the purified self reborn. And in the background of it all, the emerald tablet spoke softly. Its phrases were copied into marginalia. Its verses were whispered over boiling flasks. Its claim that all things came from the one thing, by the meditation of one mind, was taken to mean that matter itself was infused with spirit, a truly Egyptian notion, passed through the veil of Hermeticism. Even the visual culture of Latin alchemy reflected this legacy. Illustrations from alchemical manuscripts depict crowned kings dissolving into flames, suns merging with moons, and green lions devouring golden suns. These surreal images are not Christian in origin. They are Egyptian in soul, drawn from symbolic rituals once carved into temple walls and reimagined through centuries of esoteric interpretation. The use of color black, white, red, and gold mirrors the stages of mummification and resurrection in Egyptian burial rites. The very idea of death, as a phase in the transmutation of metals, echoes the Egyptian notion that death is not an end, but a doorway. The tablet's longevity in thought, not stone. By the 15th century, the emerald tablet was known to virtually every serious alchemist in Europe. Some, like Paracelsus, rejected its authority, insisting on their own methods. Others, like Basil Valentine, embraced it fully, citing it as proof of alchemy's sacred origins. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of classical texts, would further mythologize the tablet. It became part of the Prisca Theologia, the belief in a single, ancient theology revealed to humanity at the beginning of time, now partially recoverable through fragments. The tablet, short though it was, became a cornerstone of that theology. And yet, as the centuries passed, its origin remained uncertain. Where had it truly come from? Who had written it? Was it ever engraved in stone? Or was it always metaphor, a green flash in the imagination of sages? The earliest Arabic versions place it in Egypt, beneath a statue of Hermes. Later European accounts invent even more elaborate tales, that it was found in the hands of a mummified priest, or carved onto the walls of a secret vault under the Great Pyramid. No evidence supports any of these stories, but perhaps that is the point. The emerald tablet was not meant to be found. It was meant to be interpreted. Like Egyptian symbols themselves, it was designed to function across planes visible and invisible, material and spiritual. Its survival is proof of its power. Though short, though uncertain in origin, it has endured not as a stone but as a thought. It crossed the boundaries of language, empire, and religion, and with each crossing it changed but never disappeared. So we ask, is the true emerald tablet buried beneath Egyptian sand or etched into the mind of every seeker who reads its words and sees, at last, a mirror of their own transformation? The centuries have now turned once more. You are no longer in Hermopolis, nor in the courts of Andalusia, nor even in the stone cloisters of Latin abbeys. You're somewhere quieter, more familiar, perhaps a dusty study, perhaps a museum, or maybe just within your own thoughts, still echoing with that phrase. As above, so below. It is the 17th century. Europe is on the cusp of something new. The medieval worldview, dominated by allegory, religion, and tradition, is giving way to rational inquiry, systematic experimentation, and the early language of modern science. But even as microscopes are polished and new stars are charted, the emerald tablet refuses to fade. It finds its next and most paradoxical custodian in one of the most rigorous scientific minds in history, Isaac Newton. Newton and the tablet. Though remembered today for the laws of motion and gravity, Newton devoted far more of his writing, at least in quantity, to theology and alchemy than to physics. In his private manuscripts, discovered long after his death, were dozens of treatises and translations related to alchemy. Among them, a Latin translation of the Emerald Tablet. In Newton's copy, now preserved in the archives of King's College, Cambridge, the lines are written carefully, translated from a version attributed to Belinas. 'Tis true without lying, certain and most true. That which is below is like that which is above. Newton was not reading the tablet as a relic of superstition. He believed it to contain coded truths about the structure of matter, the nature of divine action, and the unity of the cosmos. In the tablet's cryptic verses, Newton saw a blueprint not for superstition, but for natural law. His private alchemical experiments aimed at discovering the vegetative spirit of matter, the universal solvent, and the quintessence were attempts to decode what he saw as the metaphysical principles underlying chemistry. For Newton, the one thing of the tablet was not a metaphor. It was real. It was the undivided, omnipresent principle that held the universe together, the same force, perhaps, that made apples fall and planets orbit. Even as modern chemistry took shape in laboratories across Europe, this idea, the invisible unity behind all transformations, remained an undercurrent, carried by thinkers who refused to accept a purely mechanical universe. It was not the tablet that had changed, it was the mind interpreting it. A symbol reborn. As Enlightenment rationalism gained ground, alchemy fell into disrepute. The Emerald Tablet, along with other Hermetic texts, was increasingly seen as outdated, mystical, or irrelevant. Yet it never quite disappeared. In the 19th century, it was rediscovered by occultists during the Hermetic revival. Figures like Eliphas Levi, Madame Blavatsky, and later the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn embraced the tablet as sacred scripture. They combined it with Kabbalah, astrology, and ceremonial magic, reviving interest in its enigmatic lines for a new generation. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, also turned to the Emerald Tablet. In it, he saw not chemical instruction, but psychic transformation. He interpreted the one thing as the self, and the alchemical stages as archetypes of personal development. For Jung, alchemy was not about metal, it was the drama of the unconscious mind striving toward wholeness. The tablet, with its emphasis on unity and transformation, became a map for individuation. And so, even stripped of its laboratory context, the Emerald Tablet continued to function, not as a historical curiosity, but as a living idea. The modern mirror. Today, the Emerald Tablet can be found in unexpected places. Quoted in New Age self-help books, inscribed in esoteric art, or studied in comparative religion classes, it remains perpetually just on the edge of explanation. Its verses have been cited in physics lectures, meditative retreats, and even leadership seminars. Though often misunderstood or reduced to cliché, its influence lingers. Its message, after all, is deceptively simple. All things came from one, through the mediation of one, so all things are born of this one thing by adaptation. Modern readers may replace one thing with terms like energy, consciousness, or quantum field. Scientists may scoff, mystics may marvel, but both acknowledge the same impulse: the search for unity, for the unseen structure that binds experience together. In a way, the Emerald Tablet has become exactly what its name suggests: not a literal stone, but a tablet of remembrance. A portable, indestructible idea passed through language, culture, and form. It has survived not because it is useful, but because it is adaptable. It is empty enough to receive new meanings, yet structured enough to preserve its shape. Its words outlived the temples, the empires, the scribes, and the languages that once gave it birth, but its function remains the same: to suggest that nothing, no substance, no soul, no experience is truly separate. The tablet's question. So we reach the end of the tablet's known journey. From temple myths in Hermopolis, to Arabic philosophers in Baghdad, to Latin monks in Spain, to Renaissance seekers and modern psychologists, it has passed silently, untouched by time's erosion. It may never have been engraved in emerald, but it has certainly been carved in thought. And so the final mystery of the Emerald Tablet is not what it says, but how it endures. not in monuments or museums, but in minds that still wonder. If all things come from the one thing and return to it, what then? Are we really trying to separate, refine, and perfect the world or ourselves? Story 5. The Tomb of Jedher, Necromantic Healing and Temple Laboratories. You step carefully down a narrow stone corridor. The air is thick, not with decay but with ritual. A single torch flickers, its glow dancing on limestone walls inscribed with rows of hieroglyphs. These aren't funerary laments or royal boasts. They are formulas, lists of substances, prescriptions, words meant not for the dead but for the living. Welcome to the tomb of Jedher the physician. Hidden near the necropolis of Saqqara, this little-known tomb doesn't belong to a pharaoh, priest, or noble. It belongs to a healer, a man whose knowledge was so revered that even after death, his chamber became something more than a resting place. It became a laboratory of healing, a shrine for the sacred science of transformation. This story begins, as many Egyptian tales do, with the duality between life and death. But unlike the grand tombs of kings designed to catapult the soul into eternity, Jedher's burial site suggests something more curious, that the power of healing didn't end with life, it continued in death. And if that's true, then perhaps medicine, magic, and the manipulation of matter were never truly separate in the first place. The healer's name and legacy. Jedher lived sometime between the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, during the late period or early Ptolemaic rule. Egypt was already a melting pot of cultures, its traditions long-standing, yet increasingly syncretic. Greek physicians had begun visiting Egyptian temples, and Egyptian scribes were recording their wisdom in both hieratic and demotic scripts, often merging the languages and ideas of multiple civilizations. Jedher, though not widely known outside academic circles today, is believed to have been a high-ranking Wab priest and physician, someone trained in temple medicine and purification rites. His tomb, discovered near the Serapeum at Saqqara, contains inscriptions and architectural features that are strikingly unusual for a non-royal burial. Most notably, it includes a detailed list of ingredients and incantations, carved not on papyrus or pottery, but directly onto the walls. Why? Because his tomb, according to some Egyptologists, functioned as both a sanctuary and a working ritual space even after his death. People came to the tomb not to mourn but to petition. In later periods, it became a kind of cult site where the sick would sleep nearby, a practice known as incubation, in hopes of receiving healing dreams. Some even left inscriptions at the entrance, "Jedher cured me," as if the physician's power had transcended the grave. This idea that healing could be transmitted from the tomb is not unique to Jedher, but his site is the clearest example of the overlap between necromancy, temple science, and medicine in late-period Egypt. Temple laboratories and practical alchemy. Jedher's tomb is located not far from temple sites where laboratory rooms have been identified, rooms specifically designated for the preparation of sacred substances. These laboratories, particularly in temples like Edfu and Philae, were inscribed with texts known as recipes of divine substances. They detail the making of perfumes, unguents, and ritual compounds used in embalming, purification, and offerings. One such room, dubbed the pharmaceutical room in the Temple of Edfu, contains stone shelves and basins used for crushing and mixing substances. Its walls are covered with formulas that list not just ingredients, but lunar phases, incantations, and divine correspondences. Each step was considered both chemical and cosmological. It's likely that Jedher trained in such places or had access to their procedures. His inscriptions mirror these temple texts, blending botanical knowledge, mineral use, and incantatory language. This was not folk medicine. It was an advanced system of practice that merged spiritual cosmology with empirical observation. Here we glimpse the heart of Egyptian alchemy, not the transmutation of metals for gold, but the transformation of matter for sacred purpose. In this view, healing an infection and purifying a corpse were both alchemical acts bringing disorder back into the cosmic balance. And this is what sets Egyptian temple medicine apart from later Greco-Roman or medieval healing systems. It wasn't just pragmatic, it was ritualized science, where effectiveness was measured not only by results, but by harmony with divine structure. The dead as participants in healing. Jedher's tomb invites an unsettling but profoundly Egyptian idea that the dead can aid the living, not symbolically but actively. In Egyptian thought, the transfigured spirit was not passive. It could act in the world, especially if properly invoked. Tombs were constructed with niches, false doors, and offering tables specifically designed to receive communication and offerings from the living, and to transmit favor or influence in return. Jedher's tomb, inscribed with his healing rituals, acted as a kind of pharmaceutical transmitter, allowing him to continue his priestly work beyond death. Such practices weren't considered taboo or supernatural. In fact, they were standard in Egyptian ritual. The difference in Jedher's case is how explicitly his healing role was preserved, his tomb serving as both a physical and spiritual dispensary. This interplay between healing and necromancy would later influence Hellenistic and Roman magical traditions, especially those preserved in the Greek magical papyri. These texts often include spells that reference Egyptian deities, healing incantations, and calls to the dead for aid. One Greek-Egyptian text even instructs, "Call upon the blessed dead, whose knowledge of herbs surpasses yours. Let them guide your hand in the preparation of ointments." It is difficult not to see echoes of Jedher here, his legacy, rippling outward from his tomb into the wider currents of Mediterranean occult and medical practice. Healing, mystery, and Egyptian continuity. In the broader context of Egyptian science, Jedher's tomb highlights something easily overlooked, that the line between sacred knowledge and scientific application was never meant to be distinct. The physicians of Egypt were trained as scribes, priests, and healers. They consulted not only physical symptoms but stars, omens, and the patient's alignment with cosmic cycles. The laboratory was also a chapel, the pestle, a ritual instrument, the tomb, a tool of transmission. The presence of healing rites in funerary context speaks to a society where death was not feared as an ending, but revered as a threshold of transformation, the most powerful phase in any alchemical process. Just as Zosimos would later describe in mystical visions of dissolution and rebirth, the Egyptian healer anticipated this process in the very architecture of the tomb: break, purify, transform. And so, Jedher's tomb becomes not just a curiosity of archaeology, but a kind of meta-laboratory, where all levels of transformation, bodily, spiritual, material, were believed to converge. It poses a haunting question. If the dead can heal the living, and the living can awaken the dead through ritual, where, then, does the boundary lie between medicine and magic, between science and spirit? The limestone walls are cold, but the words carved into them burn with persistence. You run your fingers across symbols that blend medicine and magic. Was this the work of a doctor, or a priest, or something between? In ancient Egypt, those distinctions did not matter. What mattered was power. Power over the body, power over matter, power over death. In the tomb of Jedher, the line between healing and resurrection was not metaphorical, it was functional. To understand this, we must widen the lens beyond Jedher the man and look to the institutions and ideologies that shaped him. He was not a lone healer with a bag of tricks. He was part of a larger medical theological system, one that regarded sickness not only as a biological disruption, but as a cosmic misalignment. The temple laboratories of his time, often overlooked in favor of grander pyramids and colossal statues, were the true engines of Egyptian continuity. These were rooms of boiling pots, dried herbs, sacred measurements, and careful chants where experimentation met invocation. And it is here, in the quiet procedures of these sacred spaces, that we find the origins of ritual chemistry, recipes for the dead and the living. Texts from the temples of Edfu and Dendera contain hundreds of entries describing the preparation of compounds, some medicinal, others magical. One category stands out: ointments and salves for embalming and resurrection. At first glance, these appear as mortuary instructions, but many of the ingredients myrrh, frankincense, cedar oil, natron were also used in healing the living. The overlap wasn't accidental. The Egyptians believed that resurrection was a healing process. The body was broken by death, just as it was broken by illness. It required cleansing, reconstitution, and reactivation. Jedher's inscriptions make this explicit. On one wall fragment, a formula is preserved. Take black resin, the oil of the sacred fig, and natron from the sacred lake. Heat under flame while invoking the names of the 7 gods of the breath. Anoint the body on the 5th day. It shall be filled with light. This sounds like a funerary rite, and it is, but change just a few details, replace body with limb or wound, and it becomes a medical treatment. That flexibility was central to the Egyptian worldview. The substances were tools. The power was in the ritualized intent. This dual-use nature of Egyptian pharmacy, healing and embalming, purification and preservation, shows a remarkably integrated approach to matter. The idea was simple but profound. If you understand how to preserve a body after death, you also understand how to preserve it in life. It is no coincidence that mummification included rituals of reanimation, such as the opening of the mouth ceremony, in which the senses of the dead were symbolically restored. These rituals were not symbolic pageantry. They were applied metaphysics, conducted by practitioners like Jedher, who understood that bodily integrity and spiritual coherence were 2 sides of the same coin. The living tomb, pilgrimage and petition. What sets Jedher's tomb apart is not only its inscriptions, but the way it was used long after his death. Graffiti and votive offerings suggest that the tomb was visited regularly by the sick, by mothers seeking children, and by pilgrims seeking remedies. The concept of incubation, sleeping near a sacred figure to receive a healing dream, was practiced in Greek temples of Asclepius, but in Egypt it had older roots. Jedher's tomb became a hybrid sanctuary, where the barrier between the healer and the healed was blurred by death. Petitions were carved into the outer walls, asking Jedher for intercession. One incomplete inscription reads, "I lay beside the one who heals. I was unclean. In my dream he came. In the morning my skin was." The rest is lost to erosion, but the message is clear. People believed not only in Jedher's legacy, but in his ongoing agency. This use of the tomb reflects a broader Egyptian belief in the activation of the dead, the idea that well-preserved, ritually treated individuals could become Aku, luminous spirits capable of intervening in the world. Jedher, it seems, became one of these, and his tomb was less a grave than a channel, a point of contact between realms. The afterlife of temple science. By the Ptolemaic period, Egyptian temples were increasingly under pressure. Greek rulers patronized them to gain legitimacy, but gradually, temple economies declined. And yet, the practices within them evolved. Greek and Egyptian traditions began to merge. Temple healers read both hieroglyphs and Greek medical texts. The fusion of Asclepian medicine and Egyptian ritual was not only cultural, it was chemical. New substances entered the pharmacological repertoire: opium, exotic spices, and minerals from trade networks. But the structure of temple science remained the same: ritual preparation, divine invocation, and careful observation of the natural world. In Jedher's case, his tomb may have operated as a satellite of these temple systems, a kind of memorial clinic, where formulas were preserved in stone rather than scroll, to resist fire, flood, and forgetfulness. He becomes, in this sense, a prototype for the ritual scientist, a role echoed centuries later in alchemical traditions across the Mediterranean. His preserved words also influenced later Greco-Egyptian magical papyri. In one such text, a healing spell instructs, "Speak the name of the sun, pour wine upon the copper plate, and touch the wound with your left hand. The body shall remember its shape." The notion that the body could remember, wholeness could be restored by memory, sound, and substance is deeply Egyptian. It is the idea that illness is disordering, and healing is reinscription of the divine form. This mirrors Jedher's own procedures, which always blend material treatment with verbal incantation. The scroll and the scalpel were never far apart. Jedher's unfinished legacy. The ultimate fate of Jedher's tomb remains unclear. Archaeological evidence suggests it was used for centuries, but the rise of Christianity and the eventual decline of temple practice severed the chains of transmission. By the 4th century CE, the scribes had gone. The rituals were forgotten or condemned, and Jedher became just another name carved into fatting stone. And yet he was not entirely lost. His model of healing that integrated body, spirit, and matter lived on in Christian monastic medicine, Islamic medical philosophy, and in the esoteric sciences of the medieval world. The sacred pharmacy of the Egyptians, once centered in temple laboratories, was resurrected in alchemy's slow revival in glass flasks, distillation coils, and red-tinted powders that claim to restore balance, health, and spiritual light. It is fitting, then, that Jedher's tomb survives not just as an artifact, but as a concept. The tomb as a laboratory, the healer as a threshold figure, the afterlife as a continuation of service. So we are left to ask, if death was not the end for the Egyptian physician, and his tomb a chamber of remedies, what might our own boundaries between medicine and mystery still have to learn from his stone pharmacy in the sand? The sun rises over Saqqara. The shadows of ruined temples stretch long across the sand. Somewhere beneath this earth, the tomb of Jedher sleeps. Perhaps no pilgrims come today. No sick lie outside its threshold. No incense burns in its entrance chamber. And yet, the tomb remains not only as a structure, but as a conceptual echo reverberating across time. To complete Jedher's story is to trace that echo not just to his burial, but to his intellectual afterlife. The tomb as archive. In its later usage, Jedher's tomb was more than a grave, it was a repository, both of knowledge and ritual energy. The inscriptions on the walls, carefully chiseled with exact phrasing and ingredient lists, were not random. They were meant to outlive scrolls which could rot or burn. Stone, though harder to inscribe, was eternal. Egyptian scribes knew this well. That is why formulaic spells such as those found in the Book of the Dead, the coffin texts, or the pyramid texts were often recorded in redundant, overlapping ways across burial contexts. These were not decorations. They were functional inscriptions, able to work, even if read only once or simply viewed. In Jedher's case, the medical formulas may have been intended not just for reading, but for activation. In Egyptian magical thinking, the written word, especially when spoken aloud or touched, could reawaken latent power. Thus, Jedher's tomb served as a kind of eternal ritual device. The inscriptions became voice, the chamber a vessel, the visitor a participant. This mode of thinking would echo in later mystical traditions, especially Gnostic and Hermetic ideas, in which hidden knowledge, properly accessed, could heal, transform, or awaken the soul. Jedher's archive was not simply meant for study, it was meant for action. The healer as threshold figure. What makes Jedher so distinct among Egyptian healers is his transformation in death into a liminal presence, one who exists between life and death, matter and spirit. This too has precedence in Egyptian thought. Deities like Imhotep, the famed architect and physician of the Old Kingdom, were posthumously deified and called upon for healing centuries after their deaths. Temples to Imhotep functioned as medical shrines, visited by the ill and the anxious, who sought relief through prayer and incubation. Jedhur, though not deified, followed a similar path. His tomb became a station of intercession, where his healing powers, now amplified by death, could be sought by the faithful. This understanding of the healer as threshold survives in various religious and mystical systems. Saints in Christian tradition, Sufi mystics, and even bodhisattvas in Buddhism all embody this idea, that certain figures transcend death by virtue of their healing, knowledge, or compassion, and can be accessed across the boundary. In Jedhur's case, the legacy was tactile. It was carved. The names of plants, stones, oils, the steps of application, the invocations. He did not merely leave behind reputation, he left protocol. In modern scientific terms, we might call this codification. In mystical terms, it is continuity of presence. From sacred pharmacy to silent manuscripts. By the late Ptolemaic and Roman periods, the rise of Greek medical schools, new anatomical models, and the eventual dominance of Galenic theory changed the shape of medicine in Egypt. Many temples closed, scribes disappeared, tombs like Jedhur's fell into obscurity. But the practices, though displaced, did not die. The Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, preserved in the sands of Thebes and other cities, reveal astonishing continuities. Rituals for healing include similar lists of ingredients. Incantations still invoke Egyptian gods Thoth, Isis, Anubis. Procedures mirror Jedhur's formulas, combining resins, invoking divine names, applying remedies at lunar intervals. Eventually, some of this knowledge was translated first into Greek, then into Arabic, and finally into Latin. The laboratory, stripped of its temple, re-emerged in the Islamic Golden Age as the alchemical workshop. Later, it would reappear in monastic cells and scholarly circles across Europe. The names changed, but the structure remained. Even in the Renaissance, when the pursuit of the philosopher's stone became widespread, alchemists described their quest in ways that echoed Jedhur's formulations. The body must be broken, purified, recombined. The soul must be awakened through matter. Paracelsus, the 16th century Swiss physician-alchemist, insisted that medicine was not chemistry alone, but divine science echoing, unknowingly, the traditions once carved into the walls of a tomb in Saqqara. The vanishing line. What Jedhur's tomb offers us is not just a glimpse into ancient medicine, but a challenge to the modern division between science and spirit. In our world, a laboratory is sterile, precise, and isolated from religious meaning. But in Jedhur's time and in his world, the laboratory was a sacred site, a place where matter was not just manipulated, but listened to, where substances were not inanimate, but ensouled. Each step in a recipe, each crushing of resin, each heating of oil, each recitation of divine names was part of a unified act. Not superstition, not mere ritualism, but a holistic mode of knowing. Modern science, built on reduction and repeatability, has achieved immense precision, but it has often lost that unity. Jedhur's tomb is a relic of a worldview where transformation of matter and transformation of the self were indistinguishable. And perhaps, in some disciplines like psychology, integrative medicine, or environmental science, we are only now beginning to reawaken to this truth. Closing the tomb, opening the question. Jedhur never wrote a treatise. He left no grand medical theory, but he carved his knowledge into stone, into a space that invited others to enter, not as mourners, but as participants in an ongoing healing process. His tomb has become, in retrospect, a symbol of forgotten integration, a monument to an age when healing meant listening to the stars, the soul, and the stone. And so we end, not with a lesson but with a reflection. When we strip science of spirit and strip ritual of practice, what knowledge do we bury, and what tombs must we reopen to recover it? Story 6. The Coptic Chemist, a Christian alchemist in a pagan land. A solitary man lights a small oil lamp in a narrow room cut from mud brick and limestone. He wears no priestly headdress, no amulet of Horus, no ring of power, only a rough-spun tunic and a wooden cross. And yet, on the table before him lie the familiar tools: copper vessels, carved mortars, scorched alembics, a rolled codex, and the thick scent of burnt myrrh. He is a Coptic Christian, a follower of the crucified God, but the procedures he follows, those belong to Thoth, to Imhotep, to the temple laboratories of Egypt's deep past. In this small room, perhaps in a converted shrine in Akhmim or a side chamber near Oxyrhynchus, he practices a craft that has passed through fire, language, and faith: Egyptian alchemy, now in Christian hands. This is the forgotten world of the Coptic alchemists. Their names are few, their writings rare. But between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE, these artisans, Coptic scribes, monks, and lay healers, acted as silent bridges between the last Egyptian temples and the coming Islamic world. They wrote in Coptic, a language that carried ancient Egyptian thought within a Greek alphabet. And in doing so, they preserved fragments of a dying world: recipes, symbols, techniques, and rituals that otherwise would have been lost. Their world was one of tension and transformation. Rome had long since taken Egypt, Christianity had become the state religion, and the old gods were now declared demons. Temples closed, priests vanished. But the knowledge went underground into jars, scrolls, and the quiet minds of men like our Coptic chemist. A language of transition. Coptic, the final stage of the Egyptian language, used the Greek alphabet with a few added demotic characters. Its earliest texts were religious gospels, sermons, letters, but among these were codices and fragments that did not belong to Christian scripture. In buried libraries like Nag Hammadi, we find Gnostic and Hermetic writings blending Christian, Egyptian, and Greek cosmology. In other papyri, we see something even rarer: technical recipes written in Coptic, describing the making of pigments, dyes, ointments, and substances that shimmer in alchemical significance. These aren't elaborate treatises. They are working manuals written by and for practitioners. One fragment, preserved in a 4th century papyrus, reads: "Take lead filings, mix with vinegar and ashes of date palm. Set it upon coals for 1 hour. It will blacken, then become white. This is the bone of light." Another reads: "When the moon is full, take red ochre, mix with wine and frankincense, and speak the word of the cross. This will open the body." These are not simply instructions for dye making or healing. They are ritualized procedures, echoing temple chemistry, but reframed through Christian cosmology. The phrase "word of the cross" replaces older invocations to Thoth or Osiris. The moon's phase, once linked to Isis or lunar deities, remains crucial. The transformation of matter is still the goal, but now couched in a new theological language. This is not syncretism by accident. It is strategic adaptation. Christian alchemy in a pagan landscape. How did Egyptian alchemy survive the rise of Christianity? The answer lies in 2 overlapping forces: continuity of craft and spiritual reinterpretation. By the 4th century, many temples had closed or been converted, but the practical knowledge of incense making, metallurgy, mummification, and medicine was still in demand. Christian monasteries adopted many of these functions: healing the sick, preparing sacred oils, producing inks and pigments for scripture. Coptic artisans, often former temple scribes or their descendants, continued these traditions. But now, their invocations were to Christ, the Virgin Mary, or saints. They aligned alchemical transformation with resurrection theology, seeing in the crucifixion and rebirth of Christ a model for all matter. Some even compared the philosopher's stone to Christ himself, a substance that dies and returns glorified, able to heal and transform others. At the same time, Hermetic writings, those attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, were being copied and preserved. Though originating in a pagan context, many early Christians found them compatible with their own worldview. The Hermetic principle that God is in all things resonated with Christian mysticism. In this climate, Christian alchemists in Egypt preserved core elements of the Egyptian worldview. Matter is sacred. Transformation is divine. Words shape reality. Fire purifies. Color reveals stages of inner and outer change. These ideas, stripped of their old gods but not of their structure, lived on in Coptic manuscripts and practices. The hidden laboratories of the Desert Fathers. Egypt was the birthplace of Christian monasticism. In the 4th century, men like Anthony the Great, Pachomius, and Chenault retreated to the desert to seek God in silence. But in addition to prayer and fasting, these monks built communities with gardens, apothecaries, and scriptoriums. Among their duties, preparing ointments, preserving wine, crafting inks, copying texts. Here, the manual arts of Egypt's temples merged with the devotional routines of the monastery. The Coptic monk became, in effect, a new kind of priest, a ritual scientist, whose liturgical duties included transmuting base materials into sacred substances. Surviving Coptic instructions for making chrism, holy oil, and myron, anointing balm, closely mirror temple recipes for embalming oils. The use of myrrh, cassia, cinnamon, and galbanum continued, but their meanings changed from preserving the corpse to anointing the Christian soul. In one monastic text, the preparation of red pigment for manuscript illumination is described in almost alchemical terms. It must be ground at dawn before prayers. Speak no word until it is dissolved, then bless it and it will shine. This ritual silence, this invocation of blessing, echoes earlier temple rules for handling divine substances. The vessel had changed, the spirit had not. A legacy beneath the surface. By the time Islam entered Egypt in the 7th century, much of this Coptic alchemical work had already passed into oral tradition or practical application. Some of it would be copied into Arabic alchemical texts. Other parts would vanish into the sands, surviving only as burn marks on vessels or red stains on monastery walls. Yet the impact of Coptic alchemists remains. They were the last native Egyptians to practice alchemy in their own land, in their own tongue, while translating the old gods into the language of the cross. They preserved not only techniques, but ways of thinking about matter as moral, responsive, and divine. And perhaps more than any group before them, they understood that transformation does not always look like revolution. Sometimes it's quiet, hidden, conducted in a back room with a single lamp, a chipped crucible, and a whispered prayer over the ashes. So we ask, when faith changes but the hands stay steady, what remains, what is truly transformed? The ritual or the soul behind it? A scribe sits hunched beneath a dome of crumbling plaster, carefully dipping a reed pen into a small jar of rust-colored ink. The manuscript before him is fragile, a patchwork of papyrus and parchment, sewn together from the remains of older scrolls. He writes in Coptic, a language formed from two worlds, Egyptian memory and Greek logic. Each character he traces is more than a word, it is a vessel of preservation. Outside, the empire shifts again. The old temples are dust. A new caliphate rules from afar, but the scribe does not stop. He is part of a lineage not tied to temples but to technique. He knows the measurements of powders, the prayers for distillation, the proper hour to boil red ochre beneath the light of the rising moon. He is a Coptic chemist, and though he no longer speaks to the gods of the Nile, he still listens to matter. The monastic laboratory and the alchemical liturgy. By the 6th and 7th centuries CE, Coptic monasteries were not only centers of worship, they were repositories of ancient technical knowledge. Their walls held libraries, herbal gardens, fermentation vessels, and drying racks for pigments. What had once been practiced in temple houses of life was now, in altered form, the quiet labor of monks. There is growing evidence that early Christian monasticism in Egypt preserved core Egyptian technologies under the guise of devotional practices. Perfume and ointment making became the sacred craft of anointing and healing. Pigment preparation for temple carvings continued in illuminated manuscripts and icons. Preservation of bodies was transformed into the embalming of relics and the veneration of incorrupt saints. Incense rituals, once offerings to Ra or Osiris, became part of liturgical Christian ceremonies. In effect, the chemistry of the divine simply found a new theology. A monastery might not invoke Thoth by name, but its scribe who copied and bound texts with black and red ink was still following a structure set down in Egyptian scriptoria centuries earlier. The formula had not died, it had converted. The craft of pigment and the secret of the red. Let us dwell for a moment on something seemingly mundane: red ink. In Coptic manuscripts, red ink was used to mark important headings, divine names, and magical signs, just as it was in earlier Egyptian writing. But this ink was not simply purchased, it was made, and its preparation followed a ritualized pattern. Surviving recipes, many found in later Arabic and Syriac texts derived from earlier sources, show that red ink was made from ground cinnabar or red ochre, a binder of gum arabic, sometimes vinegar or wine, heated under specific conditions, blessed or invoked upon before use. One Coptic marginal note found in a manuscript fragment reads, "Let this be done in silence. Do not speak until the red is complete." The silence is not a superstition. It is a technique of concentration, a ritual of attention. The act of making ink becomes a devotional practice, and more deeply, it reveals that matter must be treated with care if it is to carry spirit. This view, deeply embedded in Egyptian cosmology, endured in the Christian world. The scribes' materials were not neutral, they were capable of holding meaning, of bearing the sacred. Alchemy, in this context, was not only the transformation of substances, but the spiritual elevation of the materials used in God's service. Thus, the preparation of ink or balm or incense was not merely chemical, it was liturgical. The hidden chemistry of the cross. In certain Coptic alchemical fragments, many discovered only in the last century recipes, appear with explicit Christian references. One, for instance, opens with, "In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, take the white of the egg and mix with powdered sulfur. Add the ash of the olive tree. This brings forth the spirit of the fire." Another reads, "When the moon is dark, take the black stone and place it in the furnace. Say the name of Christ 3 times. It shall become like silver." These are not symbolic prayers. They are practical invocations designed to influence matter. The Christian alchemist did not see contradiction in this. To him, Christ had entered the physical world, matter had been sanctified. Therefore, to work with fire, with oils, with metals, was to work within the sacred fabric of creation. This is not unlike older Egyptian thinking, in which gods inhabited substances. The sacred was in the matter, not above it. Thus, Coptic alchemy became a conduit between worlds, carrying Egyptian ideas through a Christian framework, ready to be absorbed again by the Arabic world that would soon rise around it. From Alexandria to Baghdad, the flow of knowledge. As Islamic rulers took Egypt in the 7th century, they inherited not only land but libraries. Many early Islamic scholars, especially those working in the Abbasid-era translation centers in Baghdad, referenced Egyptian sources. Some, like Jabir ibn Hayyan, Geber, cite Egyptian practitioners and Hermetic texts preserved in Coptic or Greek. It is very likely that Coptic Christian scribes played a key role in transmitting Egyptian alchemical knowledge into the Arabic tradition. They copied and translated texts. They preserved technical terms. They demonstrated procedures that, though no longer practiced in temples, were still alive in monastery kitchens and scriptoriums. And so, paradoxically, as Egypt became Muslim, its native Christian minority became the final stewards of pagan knowledge, just long enough to hand it off to the next great civilization. This invisible role, seldom acknowledged in official histories, was critical. Without these Coptic chemists, the chain of alchemical knowledge might have broken completely. Instead, it passed on, not because of fame, but because of faithful practice. A closing fire. Imagine again that Coptic chemist in his small room heating crushed stone over flame, reciting psalms, whispering the words not of Horus but of Christ. His crucible blackens, vapors rise, and he watches not for gold but for signs. He does not ask whether what he is doing is science or theology. In his world, it is both. He knows that to change the world outside, one must also change the soul within. He is the inheritor of a priesthood he never served, a mystic of a science whose origins he cannot name, but his hands are steady, his prayers sincere, and the transformation continues. So we ask, if the flame never dies, only changes hands, then where is the alchemist today? In the lab, the chapel, the library, or still, quietly, in the ink-stained room where matter and meaning remain inseparable? The scribe is gone now. The lamp is cold. The clay crucible lies shattered on the floor of a monastery long since abandoned. And yet, fragments remain ink-stained pages, chemical residues in amphorae, faint traces of burnt incense in a chapel wall. These are the breadcrumbs left behind by the Coptic chemists, ordinary men who quietly sustained the sacred sciences of Egypt beneath the rising shadow of new empires. Their names were not recorded in history books. Their manuscripts were often unsigned, unfinished, or recycled. But their work forms a crucial, if invisible, link in the chain of knowledge that stretched from temple to monastery to laboratory. This final section explores the aftermath and legacy of that silent preservation. Disappearance without death. With the Islamic conquest of Egypt in 641 CE, Coptic Christians were gradually relegated to a minority position. Monasteries remained active, but political and economic pressures increased. Over time, the intellectual center of gravity shifted from the Nile Valley to Baghdad, Cordoba, and later, Constantinople and Paris. And yet, in the early centuries of Islamic rule, Copts continued to work as translators, physicians, and artisans. Their role in bridging ancient Egyptian knowledge and Islamic science has only recently begun to receive scholarly attention. Some served in the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in Abbasid Baghdad as translators and scribes. Others copied alchemical texts for Muslim patrons, or passed down recipes that would find their way into Arabic manuals on metallurgy, perfume making, glasswork, and medicine. Their influence is visible if you know where to look. The use of Coptic loanwords in Arabic alchemical terminology, e.g., Kimia, likely from Kim, meaning black land, an ancient name for Egypt. The persistence of Egyptian cosmological symbols like the four elements, the sun-moon duality, and the Ouroboros in Arabic alchemical diagrams. The transmission of Hermetic texts, once preserved in Coptic, into Arabic translation under names like Hermes Trismegistus and Belinas. Though the identity of the Coptic chemist faded, his fingerprints remained in the structure of Islamic alchemy, which in turn deeply influenced Latin Europe. It is one of history's great ironies. The last Egyptians to understand the rituals of Thoth were Christian scribes working under Islamic rule, preserving texts that would later be cited by Christian monks in medieval France as evidence of divine science. What was preserved and what was lost? The Coptic chemists preserved procedures: how to make ink, how to distill oils, how to extract colors from earth and plant. They preserved language, the ritualized structure of a recipe, the tone of invocation, the naming of transformations. They preserved mindset, that matter could be both a tool and a symbol, that transformation of the physical was always accompanied by transformation of the spiritual. But much was lost too. The deep symbolic associations between Egyptian deities and specific substances were largely stripped out. The ritual architecture of temples, which encoded scientific knowledge in stone, was no longer part of the practice. The full mythological cosmology, which once gave alchemy its meaning, faded as Christianity increasingly emphasized salvation over gnosis. What survived was method, not myth. Yet even stripped of its original theology, the essence of Egyptian alchemy endured in the Coptic habit of attention, in the patient stirring of powders, in the silence before the heating of a flask, in the act of writing down a process for someone unseen. Echoes in the West. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Latin Europe was rediscovering alchemy, much of it through Arabic texts that had, in turn, drawn from Greek and Coptic sources. The spirit of matter, the stages of transformation, and the dream of purification, all ideas central to Egyptian temple science, re-emerged in new Christian frameworks. The great work Magnum Opus, the Philosopher's Stone, and the symbolic process of death and resurrection through matter came roaring back into prominence. In texts like the Turba Philosophorum, Liber Hermetis, and Rosarium Philosophorum, we find phrases and procedures that almost certainly have roots in Coptic workshops and monastic laboratories. The lineage is imperfect, indirect, often fragmented, but the current is strong. When Isaac Newton pored over alchemical manuscripts in the 17th century, he was, without knowing it, deciphering ideas that had passed from temple to monastery, to mosque, to manuscript. And beneath it all, there was always the same unspoken question: can the world be healed by understanding how it transforms? A theology of matter. The Coptic chemists believed consciously, or not, in a sacramental materialism. They did not separate the world into sacred and profane. Matter was not mere clay, but the canvas of divine interaction. To work with matter was to engage with the divine. This is an inheritance from Egypt's oldest traditions, the belief that the physical world is a mirror, a stage, and a participant in cosmic truth. The Christianization of this worldview didn't erase it, it reframed it. Where once the alchemist called upon Thoth, he now called upon Christ. But the act of preparing, transforming, purifying remained nearly identical. The Coptic chemist did not merely survive between empires. He inhabited the space between worlds, maintaining a continuity that was practical, devotional, and metaphysical. He is not remembered because he was spectacular. He is remembered, if at all, because he was faithful to his fire, his ink, his materials. And through that faith, a tradition that might have died in the collapse of temples or the rise of dogma survived in jars, codices, and careful hands. The final crucible. So now the Coptic chemist is gone, but his tools remain. In a dusty monastery ruin, someone uncovers a sealed jar, still stained with residue. A faded parchment offers a recipe with Christian names and ancient symbols. A pattern emerges: transformation through humility, change through stillness, light born of burning. And you begin to wonder, was this always the essence of alchemy? Not gold, not glory, but the quiet fidelity to a sacred process. A fire watched, a prayer spoken, and matter ever so slowly turning toward light.